All right. Well, it's wonderful to be with you all. Thank you for having me this afternoon. I accepted this invitation not because I'm an expert in the area of theological anthropology, but because it would push me to keep learning. Being the first to take the stage at a conference like this is daunting. I have not yet heard what my fellow presenters have to say. I've not been able to sort of absorb the tone in the room. Until yesterday, I hadn't even set foot on your campus, and I haven't sat in any of your classes. I know very few of your faculty. I am not Southern Baptist. I have not attended the SBC. I have not been educated in a Southern Baptist seminary. So I'm in many ways an outsider. But I'm also an insider. I was born and raised in the Protestant evangelical tradition. My entire education has been in Christian schools. I grew up on Christian radio, listening to Focus on the Family and Chuck Swindoll, and even John MacArthur on occasion. I attended Multnomah Bible College, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and Wheaton Graduate School, all conservative evangelical institutions. I've been a member of the Evangelical Theological Society for 13 years. I've inhabited SBC-adjacent spaces my entire life. Judging by my Twitter feed, the majority of the people I follow care very deeply about what happens in the SBC, as do I. That's why I was honored to receive this invitation and to address you on this important topic today, and why I've taken very seriously the preparation and opportunity to be part of the dialogue here. So my task today is twofold. First, I intend to survey and summarize salient insights on the Old Testament doctrine of the Imago Dei from 4 recent evangelical scholars. I shouldn't have said it that way. That makes it sound like they're no longer with us. All 4 are still alive and well. Then, with those in mind, I intend to reassess evangelical practice with a particular focus on the SBC. At that point, it might get a little warm in here. So my blend of ignorance and proximity may have its advantages. What you're about to hear from me might be off by a certain number of degrees, but it is honest. I'm attempting to hold up a mirror so that you who are insiders will be able to see what the SBC looks like to a sympathetic outsider. I hope that my outside perspective is a gift. If it stings, I hope these are the words of a friend. Please take my admonition not as a final word, but as a prompt for deeper community reflection. Again, I'm not party to the conversations already happening on this campus, so forgive me or celebrate if I'm preaching to the choir. So first, evangelical Old Testament scholarship on the Imago Dei. My contention, which I hope is not controversial, is that if we want to understand human personhood, we must begin with the creation accounts in Genesis. They have much to teach us about what it means to be human. So let's start at the very beginning. Traditional teaching on the image of God usually revolves around the question of what makes humans different from the rest of creation. Interpreters often consider what capacity humans possess that sets us apart from animals: our rationality, our self-consciousness, our relationality. One problem with this approach is its thin exegetical basis. Focusing on human capability also carries some unintended negative consequences for those on the margins. What about humans who are less rational, or less relational, or less self-conscious, whether from birth or as a result of injury or disease? Another problem with focusing exclusively on human capabilities is that we still know so little about the animal world. Scientists keep discovering higher levels of sophistication among animal communities: communication, collaboration, relationality, even planning, that threaten to muddy the distinctions between animal and human life. Now, I don't mean to suggest that there's not a difference between humans and animals. Our intuition tells us that there is, in fact, a difference. And the Bible is absolutely and repeatedly clear that humans are the crown of creation. I'm just saying it might be hazardous to attach the doctrine of the Imago Dei to any particular perceived difference with animals, since there's still so much we don't know about the animal world, and since Genesis 1 and 2 simply is not explicit about what that difference is. Is there another way I think there is. Traditional evangelical theology on the Imago Dei has often failed to adequately consider these three areas: the ancient Near Eastern context, the literary context, and the theological context. I'd like to highlight the recent work of 4 evangelical scholars to address these deficiencies and summarize their key points. So I'm not the brilliant scholar here, I'm just bringing you the work of people I think are brilliant. I would be remiss if I did not explain why I did not include Mark Cortez. He is an evangelical and has produced a number of very important books on the Imago Dei, in which he talks about Genesis. However, his paradigm is rooted in New Testament Christology, which makes it a different sort of project, and I had hoped he would be here to be able to speak for himself and kind of contribute his perspective to the conversation. I'm sorry that he's not able to be here. So I've focused my comments on the work of Ryan Peterson, Richard Middleton, Catherine McDowell, who lives just down the road in Winston-Salem, and John Kilner. Let's start with Ryan Peterson. He's an evangelical theologian who wrote his Wheaton dissertation on the image of God. He's now my colleague at Biola University as well. He examined traditional explanations of the Imago Dei and found them wanting. So building on the exegetical work of Old Testament scholars in canonical perspective, Peterson concluded that the Imago Dei is not a capacity we possess or a function we fulfill, but it's rather our human identity. He employs a strong corporate conception of identity, I'm quoting him here, which implies that the Imago Dei is a common identity shared by all individual human beings. Human identity refers to that which uniquely identifies humanity as the particular creature that it is, defined by its relation to God. This identity is real, whether or not an individual human being knows her identity, since human identity is determined by the transcendent God who makes each creature and all of creation what it ultimately is. That's the end of the quote. So our identity as God's image should lift our gaze to God, since he is the one who defines and determines this identity. Let's turn now to Genesis 1, where the key passage on the Imago Dei. Genesis 1, 26 to 27 reads, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness.' So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them." The Hebrew word tselem, usually translated image, is not something amorphous or spiritual in nature. A tselem is quite concrete. Tselem, or its cognate salmu in Akkadian, denotes an idol or a statue, a physical representation of a king or a deity. And attention to the ancient Near Eastern context makes this clear. A king who conquered a vast territory could not be physically present everywhere, so he would set up images of himself at the far reaches of his kingdom. These statues were not the king, but they represented the king, serving as a reminder of his rule. So this statue on the slide is Hadad Yithel, the king of Guzan, and the inscription on the statue is quite interesting because it's bilingual, both Aramaic and Akkadian, and refers to the object as both a tselem and salmu, so the Aramaic and Akkadian, and a demuth, which is the other word used in Genesis 1, the word likeness. So similarly, ancient Near Eastern temples contained an image or images of the god or gods to whom they were dedicated. And in elaborate ceremonies, the idols were ritually consecrated to make present the deity in that location. Richard Middleton suggests that the entire complex narrative of Genesis 1 through 11 is written as a polemic against Mesopotamian ideology, calling it, quote, "one of the most daring acts of theological imagination in Scripture," end quote. Genesis 1 presents the cosmos as a temple and humanity as the image in the temple. Middleton notes that our identity as God's image has implications for our actions. Namely, we express it by ruling creation on God's behalf. Rulership is just one of many functions implied by our status, and Peterson talks about this as well. So returning to our key text, notice that the announcement of God's image is followed by its implications. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind, and then we go on to see God blessed them, said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sea. Every living creature moves on the ground." In Middleton's words, the Imago Dei designates the royal office or calling of human beings as God's representatives and agents in the world. Let me start the quote again. The Imago Dei designates the royal office or calling of human beings as God's representatives and agents in the world, granted authorized power to share in God's rule or administration of the earth's resources and creatures. So the words for rule and subdue imply that the image includes an exercise of power. Benevolent stewardship of creation is an essential implication of our status as God's image. We mimic God's creative activity by cultivating and naming creation, by maintaining order that facilitates flourishing. Middleton also makes a more controversial observation about this passage. While some attribute the us in "let us make humans in our image" to the deliberations of the Trinity, Middleton calls this anachronistic. While he affirms the doctrine of the Trinity, as do I, Middleton feels it's unlikely that the writer of Genesis could have intended to be talking about the Trinity. He suggests instead that "let us" refers more naturally to the divine council, the angelic host that participates in God's rule. Middleton's not alone in seeing the divine council here, but he presses it a step further to consider what might it mean that humans are made in the image not just of God, but of the angelic host, perhaps, the Elohim more broadly construed. And so the presence of the divine council suggests a communal exercise of power. So take it or leave it, just letting you know what he says. To be clear, the exercise of power is not the essence of being in God's image, but it's an implication or entailment of human identity. So whether or not we function in this capacity, we are God's image. Most scholars locate the doctrine of the Imago Dei in Genesis 1, 26 to 28, but Catherine McDowell is convinced that the image of God is also the focus of Genesis 2, even though the word itself does not appear. McDowell is professor of Old Testament at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary down the road in Charlotte, and in her Harvard dissertation, she considers the ancient Near Eastern context of Genesis 2, comparing it with the Babylonian Mispeh Pitpeh, or opening of the mouth ritual, used to inaugurate a new consecrated cult statue or image. Similarities between this ritual and the Genesis 2 account of humanity in the garden include the setting in a garden temple, the animation of the senses, the installation of the image in sacred space, the feeding of it, and the opening of its eyes, among other things. The cumulative effect of these similarities between Genesis 2 and the Babylonian rituals suggests that, quote, the ritual birth of humanity as God's image, end quote. That is, Genesis 2 presents the first human in a way analogous to a cult statue. From this, McDowell draws several conclusions about the nature of the Imago Dei, and I'll just highlight two. Along with Middleton, McDowell emphasizes our role as rulers. Central to her argument are expositions of the first human's mandate to fill, subdue, and rule over the earth in Genesis 1, as well as the human responsibility to exercise law and justice in Genesis 9, immediately following the flood. As beings made according to God's image, humans are, quote, designed to manifest his presence in the world. Second, McDowell argues that the Bible's portrait of human identity presents us as God's kin. She pays close attention to Genesis 5, where Adam's son is said to be according to his likeness. Seth's likeness to Adam is placed alongside Adam's likeness to Yahweh, offering an analogy that helps to define image as kinship. Image and likeness language also express the parent-child relationship elsewhere in the ancient Near East. We are God's family. That's our human identity. We image God like Seth images Adam. Our fourth and final evangelical conversation partner is John Kilner. I heard John Kilner speak on the Imago Dei at my first ETS annual meeting in 2009 in New Orleans. The strength of his argument was convincing. If you're interested, you can read his paper in JETS or dive into his full-length monograph on the topic entitled Dignity and Destiny. Kilner is a theologian and ethicist who teaches at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and his argument in that plenary session was simple, but I found it compelling and surprising. The image of God was not distorted or diminished or destroyed at the fall. That's his claim. It's commonplace for theologians and pastors to talk as though the fall ruined everything, or at least something, that as though some essential component of what it means to be human was lost when Adam and Eve sinned. However, the text says nothing of the sort. Some point to Genesis 5 to justify this reading. Although Adam was made in God's likeness, Seth was made in Adam's likeness, so the divine imprint has been replaced. However, it doesn't work to see this as a diminishment of the Imago Dei, because in Genesis 9, after the flood, God instructs people to honor the sanctity of human life by not murdering fellow humans because humans are God's image. Post-fall and even post-flood, the image is apparently intact. For Kilner, much is at stake in this claim that every human being is still the image of God. Without it, we lose our grounds for proper treatment of our fellow humans, a la Genesis 9. If the Imago Dei is rooted in a capacity, such as rationality or relationality or self-consciousness, what happens when someone is in a coma? What happens if someone is born with a disability? Are they no longer fully the image of God? Kilner insists, along with Peterson and Middleton, that image cannot be defined by attributes that people have, such as reason, rule, righteousness, or relationality. God bestows dignity on humans that does not depend on our abilities and is not lost due to sin. Rather, it requires renewal. So back to Peterson, he explains that because of our identity as God's image, it follows that we are most fully ourselves when we imitate God. Since we are created in God's image, we naturally take on the characteristics of the one we worship. This is one reason it's crucial that we do not worship idols. We are God's image. So the worship of idols not only dethrones God, but it also unseats us from our God-given status as his royal representatives. Christopher Wright has written about this recently as well. Peterson explains, quote, "Humanity retains its created status as the creature made in the image and likeness of God. However, after the fall, humanity practices a form of life that amounts to a lie about the Creator. That is, humanity continues in its vocation as God's image, but fails to image God in truthful ways." End quote. That is, because of our sin, humans misrepresent God to creation. So perhaps an illustration will help. I have 3 children. Say one of my daughters stops talking to me and rebels against me, and let's say we have a complete breakdown in our relationship. She's still my daughter. There's actually nothing she can do to change that, to undo the fact that I'm her mother and she's my daughter. Her status as a family member is unchanged. So the same is true with the Imago Dei. Every human being is made as God's image. As we learned from Catherine McDowell, that status implies kinship, or is at least analogous to kinship. We're God's family. Many humans are estranged from their Creator and do not live in light of that true identity as God's children. However, their family status is unchanged. In Kilner's words, Christ constitutes a complete picture of what God intends for people in God's image to be and to do. I should add that evangelicals disagree. Well, I guess I didn't limit this poll to evangelicals. So we just say humans disagree over whether every human being is the image of God. Of the 4 scholars that I've surveyed here, Peterson and Middleton insist that humans are the image of God, and Kilner and McDowell assert that only Jesus is the image of God, and the rest of us are made in the image of God, like kind of one step removed. The answer seems to ride in part on how you interpret the preposition bait in Genesis 1:26. B'Tselem, in the image, is it a bait essenche, like a as the image, or is it in the image? Does that preposition indicate a distance or not? In terms of practice, I actually see no difference. All of us agree that our human identity is grounded in this affirmation, and that our ethics rely on viewing every human in this light. We also agree that Jesus is the human par excellence, who models for us how God intends for us to live as humans. However, my working hypothesis is that to talk about being God's image, rather than being made in God's image, reinforces the concept that the imago Dei is human identity, rather than a capacity that can be lost. So I'll continue to talk about that we are the image. If you want to add a little couple prepositions in there, feel free. So let's pause a moment and take stock of these insights from these 4 scholars. And this is not everything they have to say. It's the things I liked most and wanted to share with you. Like, let's be real. So number 1, the imago Dei is not a capacity, but it's our human identity. Number 2, every human being, regardless of faith status, regardless of Christian faith, is God's image. Number 3, being God's image implies that we're God's family. Number 4, being God's image has implications for our vocation. We are to rule over creation on God's behalf as stewards of its flourishing. And again, the ruling isn't what it is to be the image, but it's an implication or sort of an outworking of that. And then number 5, every human being, by virtue of their status as God's image, possesses dignity and should be treated accordingly. I'd like to extend these insights further by considering more carefully the vocation of women at creation. In Genesis 1, it is worth noting that man and woman are both told to rule. The objects of their rule are fish, birds, livestock, wild animals, and creatures that move along the ground. Humans are given the task to rule over creation, but interestingly, not over each other. Their rule is one of partnership. But didn't Adam name Eve? And doesn't naming imply an exercise of power? Yes, Adam names Eve, but not until after the fall. If naming implies an exercise of power, which is possible but by no means certain, it could be an unfortunate result of the disruption to the partnership God had intended in Genesis 2. To put it more strongly, Adam could be overstepping his bounds since God commanded both sexes to rule and subdue the earth. It's getting warm in here. Genesis 2, the second, more anthropologically focused account of creation, portrays the man alone and in need of a partner to fulfill his vocation. Adam cannot succeed in the work God has given him to do without a partner that on the one hand corresponds to him and on the other hand is different or complementary. God made woman as his ezer, often translated helper in English. But here's what I find fascinating. Ezer never describes what a servant does in the Old Testament. The woman is not the cleanup crew or the cheerleader or the one who makes the sandwiches. She is man's ally. The word Ezer occurs over 90 times in the Old Testament. Half of these refer to God as Israel's Ezer, and the other half refer to a military ally. If you're in a battle and you're about to be stomped, you need an Ezer to come to your aid. That's a woman's vocation, to come alongside men so that we can together accomplish our God-given responsibilities as his image, ruling and subduing, guarding and keeping. We are meant to be a team. To state the obvious, the man will also be unable to fill the earth without the partnership of a woman. Together they will be fruitful, filling the earth with men and women of the next generation who will carry on this work of ruling and subduing, guarding and keeping. And as Greg Beale and others have argued, the goal was to expand the boundaries of the garden so that sacred space would eventually encompass all of creation. This gargantuan task would require the energies and, yes, the bodies of both male and female. Now, this reading of Genesis 2 and 3, I hasten to add, does not necessarily erase distinct gender roles or even a godly form of male leadership. After all, we're still in Genesis, and there's a whole lot more Bible to be read. But it's worth noting that God designates rulership that involves subduing for both man and woman to do together, and that the rulership of man over woman seems to be a consequence of the fall, not God's original creation design. So we might question then whether it ought to be our MO. And so to add to my summary, number 6, women share in this human vocation to rule over and subdue creation. Men and women are intended to be allies or partners. We could further distill this list into just 3 focus areas by which we may assess evangelical practice: the sanctity of human life, the stewardship of creation, and the partnership of men and women. How are we doing in these areas? When the world looks in on the church, what do they see? Let me say again, just to remind you, that I speak as a conservative evangelical. My conviction is that Scripture ought to inform our practice. As someone who is SBC adjacent, I'm concerned about signs that all is not well. When prominent SBC pastors and leaders are leaving the denomination because they no longer see hope for change in these areas, it strikes me as a problem of crucial importance. So first, let's consider the sanctity of human life. We have argued for humans' place as the crown of creation and for our difference from animals. This has had a profound and positive impact on education, healthcare, international aid. However, as evangelicals, we are prone to a curious and, I would say, tragic disconnect between our theological anthropology on the one hand and our support for public policies that ensure access for all people to quality education and healthcare. Let me be more specific. Evangelicals have often been among those arguing against the creation of legislation or programs to ensure affordable healthcare or accessibility of our buildings and programs. The argument goes that the government is ill-equipped to efficiently steward tax dollars, so these services ought to be provided by private corporations or churches or nonprofits fueled by charity giving. However, the huge gap between the rich and the poor in access to health care shows that this approach isn't working. At the same time that Christians have not supported this kind of legislation because they think we ought to be doing this in nonprofits, Christians have lobbied for exemptions to other legislation such as the Affordable Care Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act. A brief survey of our church buildings will show that by and large, churches are the least accessible buildings to those with physical disabilities. I don't see a wheelchair ramp up to the stage. And this is because we argued that we shouldn't have to be accessible. Secular institutions are leading the way in serving those with disabilities. If we took the doctrine of the Imago Dei seriously, shouldn't we be right out in front? Don't we believe that every human being matters? Another example, we have fought valiantly for the unborn, including lobbying for legislation to restrict abortion, as well we should, but the church has often remained silent when our fellow adults are the victims of unjust treatment. We regularly refuse to address the inhumane practices of our policing, our criminal justice system, and the disproportionate rates of arrest and incarceration among communities of color. The same crime committed by a white man is far less likely to result in arrest. Isn't it our human responsibility to lead the way in working towards a society ordered for human flourishing that sees every human being as God's image? But instead, evangelicals have opposed attempts at criminal justice reform. We are the people who say we believe in human depravity. And yet, as soon as someone wants to talk about how that human depravity might have impacted institutions or social structures, evangelicals call foul. Now, just about everyone in this room would agree that at least some tenets of critical race theory are incompatible with the teaching of Scripture. We see that it's trying to offer a totalizing attempt to explain everything that oversteps its bounds. However, the current climate in evangelical spaces like this one is such that any mention of social or systemic injustice is met with an accusation of being a Marxist or a critical race theorist, which is a distraction from the important work of reform. Some of you might have already texted somebody to complain about that CRT lady up front. I've never studied CRT, okay? Shouldn't conservatives be the first to acknowledge the possibility that human sin might have affected institutions and laws? And shouldn't we be putting more energy into rooting out racism than we do to critiquing the efforts of other people who are working to these ends? Can we agree that racism is still a problem somewhere at least some level in the world? Given that the Bible clearly teaches the dignity of every human being, it seems to me like we should be taking action. The Scriptures were the foundation of our founding fathers' conviction that all men are created equal, but our society is fraught with evidence that we have not yet achieved this ideal. It's a little hard to tell from this picture. This is a piece of art on display right now at Biola University, but the bottom word's not lit up. And the artist is trying to say, like, we have an ideal that we actually haven't achieved yet. So let's move on to a less controversial subject, the environment. How are we doing as stewards of creation? This is, after all, the immediate command connected to our identity as the Imago Dei. We preach God as creator, and we bristle at the mere suggestion that our world is the result of time and chance. But we have left almost entirely to others the task of developing sustainable technologies to steward creation. In large numbers, the polls don't lie, evangelicals have elected candidates whose express purpose is to reduce environmental restrictions for the sake of business and industry, rather than to consider more carefully the collateral damage of our way of life. Not only are we bequeathing to our children and grandchildren oceans clogged with plastic, a growing list of endangered species, waterways poisoned by mountaintop removal, farmland depleted of nutrients, and entire swaths of land made barren through short-sighted deforestation, but today, communities adjacent to this environmental degradation suffer disproportionately from the effects of our mismanagement of resources. In spite of this dire situation, some, or dare I say most, of our churches are lazy about recycling and sustainable use of resources. I don't think I've seen any recycle bins on campus, though I haven't looked in all the corners. Environmental stewardship is not a factor in most churches' decision-making and planning. Genesis 1 and 2 is clear that the fruits of the earth are to be shared by both humans and animals, and yet most of the animals we eat are treated inhumanely. Our chickens and hogs are caged. Our cattle never eats grass. Our oceans are overfished. The situation is dire, and where is the church in this conversation? Somewhere along the line, the bottom line became more important to us than sustainable stewardship. I highly recommend a recent book by Sandra Richter, published by IVP, Stewards of Eden, where she delves into what Scripture teaches on this and what are the actual problems in our world that this could address. Finally, how are we doing on the vision God laid out in Genesis 1 and 2 for the partnership of men and women as allies, both bearing the imago Dei, both carrying out God's commission to rule on his behalf? In some evangelical circles, women are often treated as temptresses rather than allies, as liabilities rather than co-laborers. We have argued ad nauseum for male headship, but have been the last ones to argue for male accountability in cases where that power has been abused. We have acted as though Genesis 3 lays out God's vision for human identity and vocation rather than Genesis 1 and 2, and as a result, SBC and other conservative leaders have told abused women to go back to their abusive husbands, putting themselves and their children at risk, all in the name of male headship. Where is our doctrine of total depravity now? Since when does the doctrine of male headship take precedence over biblical commands not to exploit, dominate, or abuse? And since when did it become a first-order doctrine? In large numbers, evangelicals have voted for politicians at every level of government, I don't need to even name names, who are known to have been unfaithful to their wives and who have sexually abused women. What does this say to the world about evangelicals' view of women? And what does it say that we have tolerated the leadership of men in our churches and schools who objectify women, fail to protect them from harm, and then don't take their testimony seriously? We have built entire denominations on the backs of women's volunteer labor while failing to educate women theologically. Here's what conservative women tell me directly. Now, I'm really happy to hear that the number of female students at Southeastern has gone up dramatically over the past 10 years. Good on you. But here's what women are telling me directly. They don't pursue theological education because it seems irresponsible to go into debt for an education for which there is no paycheck guaranteed on the other side. These are women who are bright, with servants' hearts, who possess the aptitude for further study and are in fact hungry to learn and grow. They're passionate about Scripture and theology, but their churches, our churches, often have no place for them to invest unless they want to volunteer. And so they sell essential oils, or handbags, or makeup, or Tupperware. This is a tragedy. Here's a bonus. I don't even have this one on the PowerPoint. We have championed marriage and the nuclear family so long and so loud that singles have had a difficult time feeling like full-fledged humans. Every one of us starts out single. Some remain single for their entire lives, and most of us will be single again at some point. We have got to develop a theology of personhood that embraces singles as vital members of our faith families and as whole people, not half people. If we don't, we will lose a significant percentage of the next generation, especially those identifying as same-sex attracted and their friends. We cannot, on the one hand, say to them, the Bible calls you to stay celibate. You can't marry who you're attracted to. And then on the other hand, fail to include singles in the life and the teaching of the church. Last night I couldn't sleep. I changed like 3 time zones. So finally I gave in and was scrolling through Twitter, and I literally saw a tweet from someone that says, "My friend is a lesbian and believes that the Bible teaches that she is to remain celibate. So she went to her church and she asked them, would you do a blessing over me? Would you bless me to a life of celibacy?" And the church asked her, "What do you want from us?" And she said, "I want you to be the family that you're telling me I can never have." And they said, "People are too busy for that." Women are not in the places where decisions are being made in our churches. Women's free labor is valued more than women's voices. More than half of those in our congregations are women, and the men who lead are missing out on the perspective, gifting, wisdom, energy of half the church. This seriously breaks my heart. Now, I'm speaking in generalities without naming names, quite on purpose. Maybe this assessment does not describe you personally. Good on you. Maybe your church or this school is the exception to the list that I've read. But if the shoe fits, I hope you'll consider shopping for a different pair of shoes. There is, in short, a radical disconnect between the priorities of Scripture and the priorities of conservative evangelicals. Is it because we assume that the Imago Dei was lost at the fall? Does God's vision at creation no longer pertain to the world in which we live? Do we feel we're simply doomed to live in a Genesis 3 world? Our relationships with each other, with the land, and with God characterized as adversarial until the whole thing goes up in smoke? That seems to me a very poor reading of Scripture. When I read Genesis, a different picture emerges, one of hope for the seed of a woman who will come and crush the serpent so that the purposes of creation might be realized, purposes that include partnership, stewardship, and dignity, and that make it possible for us to live together in the presence of God again. I have a dream that as evangelicals, we can recover this vision of our identity and vocation. Could our doctrine of the Imago Dei be resurrected to new life? Imagine with me, what if male church leaders saw women not as fragile or dangerous and instead viewed women as allies and partners, persons whose insights, energies, and gifts were vital to the work of the ministry? What if the SBC and other conservative denominations renewed our commitment to providing access for women to seminary education so that women's participation in the life of the church was nourished by time spent in theological reflection? What would this mean for future pastors who attend seminary? They will have lived experience of learning alongside women, and yes, learning from them. I applaud Southeastern for inviting me and Dr. Peeler to speak on the topic of theological anthropology. I'm glad you took this risk. Some of you are probably sorry at this point that you did. I applaud you for offering scholarships for women, for forming the Biblical Women's Institute and the Society for Women in Scholarship. Without the voices of women, we will be impoverished. What if those in leadership use their position to protect the most vulnerable members of our communities rather than to justify their buddies who abuse their power? What if the SBC became known as the denomination with a zero-tolerance policy for sexual abuse? Wouldn't that be great? What if women flocked to the SBC because they knew they'd be able to bring all of who they are to kingdom work? And they knew they would be safe. What if instead of hashtag SBC2, the hashtag was SBC Thriving? What if people who are same-sex attracted found our church's vision of the family of God captivating and knew they would find loving community even in celibacy? What if we took seriously our mandate to rule creation and saw creation care not as a distraction from our vocation, but as a way of leaning into what it actually means to be human? What if churches and Christian colleges and seminaries led the way in recycling and sustainable use of resources? What if we pooled our resources to address these problems in our community? What if we took to heart that consumerism, without regard for the environment, disproportionately harms the world's most vulnerable populations? Now, I can hear some of your objections in my head because this is what my dad would say to me. Carmen, recycling doesn't work. Don't you know that our plastic recycling ends up in landfills in China? That's precisely my point. What if instead of throwing in the towel because the system is broken, what if the church led the way in fixing the problem? But Carmen, you say this is not a gospel issue. I simply refer you back to Genesis 1, 26 to 28, where it seems very clear to me that creation care is at the very heart of our God-given human vocation. I applaud Southeastern for being a Great Commission seminary. what if everyone who goes would bless the communities where they serve with sustainable practices to promote human flourishing? What if our belief in the sanctity of human life extended past birth? What if our church buildings were the most accessible places for people with disabilities to fully participate? What if there were wheelchair ramps not just to get in the back door, but also to get up on the platform? What if evangelicals were known as the ones most likely to work for access to healthcare and education, who insisted on equal pay for equal work, and were the first to stand up against racial discrimination? What if people of color knew that their voices would be most highly regarded in the SBC? Hear me out. What if they knew that their faces would not just end up in our glossy promotional brochures, but that they would be in the room where decisions are being made? What if students of color flocked to our seminaries because they heard it was the place to be, because they saw people of color in leadership and felt confident that their education would empower them to serve diverse communities? Call it a midlife crisis, or call it a manifesto, or call it both. I've spent almost 4.5 decades as a deeply engaged member of the evangelical church. I've read the books, listened to the radio shows, attended the conferences, and yet the more I read scripture with the global church, the more I'm puzzled by some of the ways the white evangelical American church has flat out missed some of the most central dimensions of our human vocation: creation care, the partnership of men and women, and the affirmation of the human dignity of all people without regard to race, nationality, sex, class, or gender. As Russell Moore put it, we now see young evangelicals walking away from evangelicalism not because they don't believe what the church teaches, but because they believe that the church itself does not believe what the church teaches. I believe with all my heart that the Imago Dei was not lost in Genesis chapter 3. The fall of Adam and Eve was not the fall of the Imago Dei. It was rather a breach of trust resulting in a family crisis. However, judging from the evangelical movement today, I fear we've lost sight of the Imago Dei. And that's why I'm so glad that the topic of theological anthropology is front and center today. We have a lot to recover. Thank you.
So let me start with this question. Dr. Imes, first of all, so you're a professor of Old Testament, you teach Old Testament. And of all the things that you could focus on and study on, I'm just curious personally, why so much interest in Imago Dei and personhood as an Old Testament scholar?
So my doctoral dissertation was on the command not to take the Lord's name in vain. And my reading of that command is that it's not a prohibition of swearing or oath-taking, but it's actually sort of leaning into this idea that at Sinai, Yahweh put his name on his people to claim them as his own. They belong to him. And so the command is saying, don't carry my name as my representatives in a way that brings me dishonor or misrepresents me. So I was already sort of set up to be thinking about Imago Dei, because often what's happened as people have read my work, and I've been on lots of podcasts to talk about this concept, almost inevitably some will say, well, isn't that kind of like the Imago Dei? Like, we're God's representatives on the earth, and they want to sort of blend the two. And so I have like a 2-page discussion in Bearing God's Name where I say these are different, but they're kind of analogous to each other. So every human being, I believe, is the image of God, but only the covenant people bear God's name. So it's a similar representative role, but the scope is different. And so I just decided we need another book. We need the book on what does it mean to be human that sort of precedes the what does it mean to be the covenant people. So I sort of fell into it backwards, which is why I'm writing the prequel now.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, here's one of the questions that has 11 likes. That's the way we do it these days. So the question went like this. I'll read it as it's stated. If a pastor is persuaded that the office of pastor or elder is exclusive to men, how can he best promote women's leadership without sacrificing his belief?
Yes, I love that question. I suspect that it, would have more than 11 likes if we were all on the app. So my suggestion is to find ways to incorporate women's voices into your sermon preparation, to put yourself in spaces where you're going to hear how the text will land. So I attended church with male elders, and up to this point, women haven't done any preaching in my church as well. I've preached elsewhere, but the church we landed in now hasn't had women preaching. And the pastor came over to our house a few weeks ago because he was getting ready to do a sermon on Isaiah. It had some Exodus echoes. He knew I was an Exodus person, and so he said, "Can I just ask you about this passage, and can you help me see what's here?" And so I helped him with his sermon, and then he preached it and thanked me during his sermon. That's one way. Like, we can collaborate together. We can learn from each other, but we can't do that if we're not talking to each other. So, I didn't bring this out very much in my talk as much as I could have, but we sometimes think of the partnership of men and women as only in marriage, like marriage is a partnership, but the Imago Dei passage isn't talking about a husband and wife. It doesn't specify husband and wife. It's man and woman, and I think this goes back to the singleness question too, and interacting with gay Christians. It's like we've got to figure out how to do partnership outside of marriage as well, and to work well together, even in churches where there are certain roles that are restricted for women. Like, I'm not trying to overturn the apple cart. I would say, there are lots of things women can do. Maybe you could create paid positions for them to do that and encourage them to get theological training so they do it well.
The next question relates to that very last point that you just made. How do you think women should begin approaching their churches about formal and even paid positions of leadership? It
depends on the church. Like, you got to feel things out, right? But I feel like for a woman to let her pastor know what an interest she has, a desire to study, maybe creating your own job description. My husband and I have often been in situations where, like, they didn't have a job description and they created something for us. So I'll give an example. When I was in high school, my pastor saw in me sort of a passion for missions. I wanted to be a Bible translator, and he wanted to nurture that, and I was, 15? So the church was very supportive in sending me on short-term mission trips, but then he also created a position as missions coordinator, which we didn't have yet, and he let me get up front and give a missions blurb every month in front of the congregation, and I could choose what to talk about. I would tell him ahead of time, here's what I'm going to talk about. He created space for me. It wasn't an elder role. It wasn't a paid position, but it was a way that he could sort of nurture those gifts. So be creative. Here's another thing he did that just blows me away to this day. So I went off to Bible college, and my first year of Bible college, I was just like, oh, I'm learning all this amazing stuff. One of the classes that blew my mind was understanding worldviews. I'm like, why didn't anyone ever tell me this before? It was postmodernism and Hinduism and like all these different worldviews. I'm like, people should know this stuff. And I was chatting with my pastor about it, maybe over spring break, and he's like, how about you come and teach a class for us at church? And I said, that would be fun, like kind of an adult Sunday school kind of class. And he not only encouraged me to do that, he required all the pastoral staff and the elders to attend my class. So that was my class. It was all the elders and their wives and the children's pastor and the youth pastor, and they had me teach. This was me at 18 years old. And in that context, that worked. Maybe in your context, that doesn't quite work. I hope it does, because it was a lot of fun for me and for them.
So I'm curious. I'm going to get away from Slido for a second, but you introduced yourself as I'm a conservative evangelical teaching at Biola University.
Yep.
A female teaching Old Testament. I'm just curious, how has your experience been in the institution? This is being recorded, I think. I'll just let you know that. But in the institution, as well as in your classroom. I'm just curious how it's been.
It's been wonderful. I've been very warmly received by my colleagues. I do have colleagues, a couple of them, who do not believe women should be teaching Bible, even in a college setting, and they've been very kind to me. So it's not a hostile environment. I'm the first full-time female teaching Old Testament in Biola's history, 113 years. It was time. And let me tell you why it was time. I had a student in my office not long ago who said, my sister went to Biola 8 years ago. She's now walking away from the faith, and her reason is because she doesn't think the Bible is good for women. She had all her classes with male professors. She sees the passages that are difficult, that seem misogynistic, and she doesn't know what to do with them, and no one told her how to handle them. And so she's deconstructing. What can I tell her? How is the Bible good for women? And I feel like I'm just naturally bringing up those kinds of things in class so that men and women in the class are able to have those conversations.
Very helpful. Okay, there's two questions that kind of overlap here, one of which is Dr. Peeler's question. So I'm going to read them both. They both deal with adoption language and how that relates to Imago Dei. So the first one goes like this. If the Imago Dei has kinship implications, as you mentioned, how does that relate to the adoption language of the New Testament? And then Dr. Peeler's question, similarly, if the Genesis narrative suggests that all humans are God's family, in what way does being adopted by Christ's work change or adjust that identity?
That's actually what I'm hoping to figure out this weekend, so I hope some of you can help me with it, because I like the kinship. I see the kinship thing, but I see what the New Testament's doing. So here's my very newly emerging idea. I was reading Kilner's Dignity and Destiny. I was reading the rest of it on the plane yesterday, and this was the idea that emerged as I was reading. So this is not tested by time. He talks about that we're being renewed in the image of Christ, like that we're being spiritually reborn in the New Testament. And so I wonder if physically in our human personhood, we are already part of God's family. But as Jesus is the first fruits of the new creation, and we enter into that new creation, resurrection life, if there's a second layer of like adoption that happens in that new reality, like that, I'm not sure if that works. That's what I was hoping to ask y'all. So
something tells me Father Bear will have some comments on that later on, and when we get to that, but we'll consider that at that time.
I've written 75% of the Image of God book. I'm in the New Testament part going, now what do I do? So hoping to learn.
If we are all an image of God, I'm reading that right, I think. If we are all an image of God, as in He is part of us, what does that say about the dwelling of the Holy Spirit in non-believers?
I'm imagining what Catherine McDowell might say because of her work on the Miss P, Pit P ritual. Like you make the idol, and then you go through this ceremony in which you breathe into it, and so then I'm wondering if there's sort of a two-stage. It is an image, but it's not animated with the presence of God until it has the breathing happen, which is what we see in Genesis 2 when God breathes into Adam and he becomes a living being. I wonder if us having the Spirit animates us to fulfill God's intention for our personhood as His image, but that's untapped in unbelievers. Yeah. I don't know. That's, again, I'm just floating a thought.
Two more, a little more practical questions, and they both ask the kind of what does it look like to do the kinds of things that you ended your talk with. So one of them being, what does it look like for churches to begin to prioritize women's access to seminary?
Yeah, I would say we need to think about ways of paying women to do ministry in the church or of supporting their seminary education if they're going to end up as volunteers, so that it actually makes sense to go to seminary and expend money to do that, because then there's a path out of that. I'm not saying it has to be full-time even, but like, do you have a women's ministry director at your church, children's ministry director? Are they paid what the men on staff are being paid for the same labor? Like, is that labor being valued? My mom has mostly volunteered her whole life, and I'm watching the toll that it's taken on her to not have anyone recognize that her time is also valuable. So if my dad does something, people give him money, but if my mom does something, they just say, oh, thanks, and there's no money. So like, let's put our money where our mouth is. If we say women are equal, made in the image of God, then they're worth paying. I think that's one thing. I think We can also highlight the voices of women, even if your church doesn't have women preaching. Can you read commentaries written by women, other books written by women, and have them as part of your sermon series so that your congregation is seeing that you can learn from a woman? And then your women in your congregation will know, like, oh, women have a contribution to make here, even if they're not in the pulpit.
So the other side of that question,
Yeah.
similarly, when it comes to creation sustainability kinds of things,
Yeah.
what types of first steps can the church and can Christians take in those directions?
Sandy Richter's book is such a good first step, actually, to read together. It's short, but if you thought I was kind of bold, Sandy Richter's very bold. She teaches at Westmont, out on the West Coast. She was at Wheaton before that, and part of my dissertation committee. And she's done a lot of research into environmental care. And she's got great discussion questions for every chapter. So she's looking at, what does the Bible teach? How are the laws in Deuteronomy aimed at creation care? Things I've never noticed before. And then how might we think about buying our food in sustainable ways, making sure that so Sandy moved her family from Wheaton to Westmont, and the first thing she did was got chickens. So they have chickens in their backyard, and they're trying to participate, in more sustainable way of life. So there's lots of people out there who are better at this than I am. But if you are in an institution that's not thinking about recycling, you can be that voice. Like the administrators can't do everything, right? They're only going to do the things that people care about and have the energy to contribute to. So if you see what needs to be done, say, hey, I'd like to help. Can I be like on a task force to help think about how we could recycle in our institution? Or like, could we get rid of the styrofoam cups and switch to something that biodegrades? There's a lot of things for our administrators to do. They can't care about every little step of it, but all of us, no matter where we're at in an institution, can come and volunteer and say, I'd like to, be part of the solution to this.
So speaking of the solutions, if you were to name 1, 2, or 3 evangelicals that you feel like are moving the needle in the right direction on these areas that you mentioned, who comes to mind?
I think Beth Moore is somebody who's modeling a really kind of gracious dialogue with people who don't disagree with her. Obviously, she left the SBC. That was kind of sad for y'all because she's a treasure. I joined Twitter just to follow academics, and I started following Beth Moore, and I was like, I'm staying for Beth Moore. She just says, she's funny, and just exudes such grace towards the people who are even so mean to her. So I feel like she's leading the way in modeling a kind of partnership. So I think Sandy Richter's leading the way on thinking about environmental sustainability. I'm a big fan of the Jude 3 project, which is working to elevate African American voices and share resources and education in African American communities, just in terms of thinking about diversity. I'm also part of a new initiative that's being led by 3 academics, Brittany Kim, who's in the Chicago area, Andrew King over at Midwestern, and Charlie Trim at Biola, have started an organization called Every Voice Kingdom Diversity Initiative. And so I'm one of the fellows of that group. And basically right now it's a website. We're hosting conversations between, for example, Black pastors and white academics, or I guess we had more than just white, but mostly white academics, to talk about how can we build better bridges between the Black church and our seminaries and our schools. Like how can we become better partners in the work of training people for ministry. We're working on developing bibliographies of Black Old Testament scholars, Arab Old Testament scholars, Latino Old Testament scholars, so that if you're teaching a course or doing a project and you'd like to have more than just white male voices as part of your research, you can more easily find who's out there working on this issue. So that's a place that you can check back to if you care about everybody being at the table.
Will you join me in thanking Dr. Carmen Imes?
Thank you.